Okay, so welcome back. Again, I'm Kobe Lund, and this is the functional assessment of problem behavior and subsequent behavior plan development. This is part two. So if you're jumping in here, you missed part one, obviously. So you may want to go back and watch that one. I left off talking about actually conducting an FBA so that you can then design an appropriate behavior plan. So we're going to talk briefly about some ways to collect information as a part of that functional assessment. And what I'm going to talk mostly about are some descriptive tools. Remember, at a descriptive level, you have data collection and direct observations. These would probably constitute the majority of your assessment effort or resources, unless, again, you need to refer a student for functional analysis. And just, again, to reiterate, that's really the gold standard of identifying functions of behavior. But there may be many cases for many of your students where indirect and descriptive tools will certainly be useful to design effective behavior plans. So we're going to talk about some of those descriptive tools. Now, I'm really going to emphasize two different ways to do this. The first of which includes a data sheet. And as I mentioned at the end of last segment, this is one of the resources that will be in that folder to which there's a link in the description. So presumably, at this point, many of you are watching this on YouTube. There should be a link in the description that has a folder of resources, one of which is this behavior data collection tool. And this is a way to get ABC information about data. If you have the misfortune to need to collect data on paper, this is a good way to do it, although there are a number of data collection ABC tools. Frankly, you could probably Google it and find a dozen. You could design your own, some of which are more based on sort of check sheets, some of which sort of require a lot of written data. Those are all ways to collect this information. There's no one that is particularly more or less appropriate. In a minute, I'm going to talk also about a way to collect this information electronically using a mobile device such as an iPad. Certainly that would be my preference, but there may be parameters that require paper. So let's talk about this one. This is a data sheet that includes a few different sections and the ability to include several different instances of behavior or sort of behavioral events. And I'm going to go through each of those in detail. So I'll zoom in on each section. This probably isn't going to be big enough for you to see. So if I zoom in on that first section there, those are behaviors. So I'll zoom in even further, and we'll sort of talk about each of these separately, but it's divided into sections where I would score a particular behavior. The next section relates to antecedents. So in this section, I would score the things that seemed to precede my target behavior, which antecedent or antecedents seem to cue this behavior that we're measuring. The next section is consequence or response. What were the things that happened afterwards? Certainly these might be things that I did in response to the behavior, but they can also just include outcomes. Things that this student seemed to get out of a particular behavior. And then this section includes location. So I can identify a lot of sort of ancillary information when I have patterns that relate to location. So especially for school-aged people, having information about location, were they in a learning environment, were they in sort of a play environment, community, classroom, or even more specifically math, reading, science or so forth, I can get more information about particular antecedents. Right, so if I have a student who's consistently or sort of disproportionately engaging in inappropriate behavior in reading, I'm probably identifying reading as an antecedent for inappropriate behavior. And while that may also lead me to hypothesize that that behavior is maintained by or serves a function of escape avoidance. Part of intervention might be reading remediation, right? To make that particular task or activity less aversive, thereby decreasing that student's motivation to avoid it. Having that information can be useful in terms of planning. And then lastly, you see also some measures related to duration and intensity or severity. So when we measure various components of or characteristics of behavior, there are several different pieces of information that we want to get. Some of them serve diagnostic purposes, right? I want my ABC data. I want to know about antecedents and consequences and time of day and locations and so forth, and that can help me design treatment. But also, what I can get from this data includes things like frequency. How often is this behavior happening? How long is it lasting? And how severe is it? These are pieces of information that relate to topography. So they don't help me design treatment, but they can help me evaluate this student's response to that treatment. Is the frequency going down? Is the duration going down? And or is the intensity decreasing? Hopefully all three, but there may certainly be situations where one of those is decreasing, and therefore you can conclude that this intervention may be effective. So if I have a student who engages in tantrum behavior, for lack of a better term, it's not very technical, but most of you probably can relate to that and understand what that might look like. In fact, my own kids, hopefully they'll never see this video, had tantrums when they were younger. And they included a variety of behaviors, crying and falling to the floor and, non-compliance and so forth. And when they were young, while those behaviors, those tantrum behaviors certainly decreased in frequency, ultimately to 0, it was also awfully useful to us when the duration decreased and the severity decreased. So those were all characteristics of tantrum behavior that we wanted to decrease. So that's a topographical measure as well. Those are all pieces of information that I can get. And then if I didn't mention this before, at the top you also have date and time. The time is useful because it can also help you identify other things that may be going on. So if you have a behavior that's occurring frequently between 9 and 10 in the morning, of course your next question should be what's happening between 9 and 10 in the morning. That's going to point you in the right direction. Conversely, if you never have behavior between 11 and 12, that should lead you to ask, well, what's going on then? Or is there something going on then that we can replicate? And we've discovered in several other places that inappropriate behaviors are very much less likely to occur when students are using a computer. And this, by the way, is true of general education and special education students. That can help as we design a school day, or frankly a day for any person, school-aged or not. And it can help us design a day that includes computer time during particularly difficult times or sort of interspersed throughout the day. That's also, the time gives us useful information about when we might want to schedule different activities. Okay, so the way that I would use this particular data sheet includes scoring several different columns. So what you should see right now is a highlighted column. And within each of these columns, I would obviously have a date, a time, one or more behaviors that I would check in that top section, one or more antecedents that I would check within that same column that seem to cue that particular behavior, one or more consequences, one location. A behavior can't start in more than one place. It could certainly spill over to more locations. Something might start, in the hallway and, sort of go to the next room. What you really want to know with location is where a behavior started. Once a behavior starts, if I pick a person up and move them to another room, that the other room didn't really have anything to do with the behavior. So That should only be 1. And then, of course, at the bottom there, I would want to record duration. How long did this behavior last? And then a subjective measure of intensity. Of course, if you have a scale of, say, 1 to 5, with 1 being fairly mild and 5 being severe, that will vary from one person to another, and even within the same person that can vary. If I've already had a hard day, I might score this sort of higher than I would otherwise. But it's very difficult to get objective, sort of reliable information on severity without having, some sort of force per square inch measurement tool. So you have to take that one with a grain of salt, but over long periods of time, it is one more useful piece of information to include with the others. And then, of course, there are several columns on this same data sheet. So in fact, I could record about a dozen. I guess there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15. I could record 15 different events on this one data sheet. And I would have that diagnostic ABC data for each of those events. So if I zoom in a little bit closer, you can see in the behavior section, the notion is that you would identify as many behaviors that you might want to score for a particular individual ahead of time, so you don't have to spend a lot of time writing these down when behaviors actually happen. So just as an example, this student might exhibit a variety of inappropriate behaviors: screaming and yelling, throwing things, aggression, property destruction, and so forth. And in any one event, there might be one or more of these behaviors that occurs. And so you can see, as an example, on January 5th at 1:45, this student engaged in an event that included screaming and yelling, throwing things, being aggressive, and falling to the floor. And so during this one event, I would check each of those particular behaviors. In that same event, it appears as though the antecedent was being denied an item or activity. In other words, being told no. So this student wanted something and couldn't have it, and those behaviors resulted. And so in this case, I only checked off one antecedent. Now, you can include more than one. You want to sort of take your best guess. What does it seem the antecedent was to this behavior? Sometimes you might not know. Sometimes sometimes it seems like this behavior came out of the blue, but you want to take your best guess. Over time, as we collect more and more data on this student's behavior, we can develop more patterns related to the functions of this student's behavior. Being denied an item or activity, by the way, is a pretty common antecedent, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And then related to consequences, the same is true. I want to identify as many of those ahead of time as possible so that I don't have to write them down. I can, of course, write them in if I need to. Maybe there's a unique consequence. We were in an unusual or unfamiliar place, and we sort of did the best we could, and so we delivered a consequence that wasn't typical. I can write that in, but for the most part, I probably have a toolbox of pretty common consequences that I would deliver. And sticking with that same example, this particular student went to timeout for that target behavior, and of course gained some attention for that. In this case, that probably means that behavior's not okay, you need to go to timeout. Judging by the behaviors, which included falling to the floor, that might have included some physical redirection as well, although it's not scored there. So I'm also going to include one or more of the consequences that were associated with that behavior. And then lastly, in location, where did this particular behavior occur? And in that same example, it occurred in the classroom. It lasted 3 minutes, as you can see. And the intensity was scored as a 4, so relatively severe, as you might deduce from the nature of the behaviors themselves. And so over time, as I collect data on more of these behaviors, I should have some patterns related to those antecedents and consequences and locations. And then some topographical information related to a baseline for frequency, duration, and intensity. Now, I also want to, so that's an example of some paper data that you can use to collect this information. I also want to show you an example of how you can collect the same data electronically. There are a number of advantages to doing it this way if you can. And in particular, if you use a system like Catalyst, I know that probably most of you are familiar with that, if not using it directly. This is an online system that integrates with a mobile device where data are collected and then automatically synced to the online portal where those data are stored and managed. So I still need to collect the data on the device, but then there's no future transfer to Excel or some other type of spreadsheet. So the nature of the data collection is fairly similar. I'm going to bring this up on the iPad. You should be able to see that on your screen now. Which you can't. Can you? Okay. Well, let's do this. Just take a quick break and I'll... Wait, no. I know how to bring it up. I know what the problem is. Now you should be able to see it. Okay. Crisis averted. So this data is the same sort of information. It's just collected in a different way. And again, it's organized roughly into behaviors, antecedents, and consequences. What you should see at the top here includes severity. So if I am scoring a particular instance, I might score it as mild. And then there's a place to score a response, basically meaning in response to my intervention, in this particular event, did this student seem to improve, not change at all, or escalate? And I'll of course say he improved. Was this in a group, an independent activity, one-on-one? And I'll put one-on-one. And then there are a number of behaviors that, again, I've identified ahead of time. I can add behaviors if I need to, but of course the notion is I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that. So maybe this included self-injury and spitting. And these were a result of me making a request. And as a result of this behavior, the student was, say, removed from the classroom. And this happened in homeroom. And then I save it. So it's the same sort of information that I collect. I want to have some measures for diagnostic information. And this is certainly two different examples of ways that you can get that information. Again, there are a variety of paper examples, and hopefully you have access to an electronic version like Catalyst. But that should allow you to get that information and utilize that information in a way that's more efficient. Now, what I want to move to next is what you do with all that. So once you've been collecting your ABC data, you've gotten some direct observations, you've gotten input from team members, parents, other instructional providers. What do you do with that information? So in either case, you should certainly end up with some graphic representations of your data. You should be able to graph what are the commonly occurring behaviors and what are the antecedents and consequences for them. So I'm just going to bring you an example of the Catalyst data. And there are two ways that you can get to this. If you're using an electronic system like Catalyst, then it's just here. Right, so this data, in fact, that I just entered is now in this student's graphs. If you happen to be collecting it on paper, then you need to use some sort of spreadsheet software like Excel to enter your data and graph it. So you'd need to take your paper and enter all those data. But what you should produce if you do such a thing is a variety of graphs that look like this. These are things that I want to look at. So the one on your screen now includes consequences for this student's elopement behavior. So if you look on the left here, there are a variety of behaviors that are being tracked for this particular student. And as I click on each one of them, it shows me a graph of the consequences for each of those behaviors. So if I go back to elopement, I can see that the most commonly occurring consequence for that behavior is physical redirection. As you might imagine, if I have a student who takes off, I'm probably going to have to go get him. So that's probably going to get scored in most cases as physical redirection. Identifying these consequences can help you derive hypotheses about function. And as you look at each particular behavior, you may need to design different intervention strategies for each one. They may serve different functions. So if I look at self-injurious behavior, certainly physical redirection is also a commonly occurring consequence for that one. You can see that it's roughly 20%. But you see that just as commonly timeout, a rules review, which is basically attention, and planned ignoring, which is basically an opposite consequence, are occurring just as often. So I've got some more information about these behaviors. Now I may also want to look at commonly occurring antecedents for these behaviors. So you see, if we stick with the self-injurious behavior, that adult made a request and denied reinforcement are the two most commonly occurring antecedents for this behavior. They're both roughly just under 30%. So about a third out of all of the instances in which this student has engaged in self-injury, about a third of them have been preceded by request or demand, and about a third by being denied reinforcement. Some of those can co-occur, by the way. Those don't necessarily need to be mutually exclusive. But that gives me information about how this behavior might function or what the function of this behavior might be. So certainly, if it's denied reinforcement, this student wants something and can't have it, engages in inappropriate behavior as a result. One hypothesis might be that this behavior functions to access tangible reinforcement, or that this behavior functions to communicate, I want that. It's to get something, right? I want this particular item or activity. With regard to the request, and this one, by the way, is common. Think of it as a demand. So this target behavior is being preceded by some demand. I'm asking the student to do what he or she doesn't want to do. Generally, this is indicative of an escape avoidance function, right? So if I'm the student, you present some demand, you ask me to do a reading assignment or a math assignment, and I engage in self-injury as a result. One hypothesis is that I do so to escape or avoid the demand that you just placed on me. And I can tell you anecdotally that that is often true, right? If I stop and start hitting myself or biting myself, I can often delay or maybe even avoid that task altogether. So this information helps me in my functional assessment. So right now we're only at the hypothesis part. I'm using this antecedent and consequence information to make or derive hypotheses about functions of behavior. So for these behaviors that we're trying to change, my hypothesis is, I think this behavior is maintained by escape avoidance and possibly access to reinforcement. Okay, so let's go then to, once I have this information, and by the way, you may need some help with this. It's okay to, as you start to design your plan, talk to your board certified behavior analyst about what might be appropriate intervention strategies based on these various functions. So let's start talking about that. As I mentioned, if you remember from part one, the first piece of two, at least two, that we want to include once we identify function is trying to remove or reduce those consequences that maintain negative behavior. So if we know that this behavior is maintained by attention, or we hypothesize that this behavior is maintained by attention, certainly one piece of the behavior plan is let's attend to this inappropriate behavior less. At the very least, let's not have big discussions about it when it occurs. Oh, Thomas, you know you're not supposed to do this. We've been working so hard on this. You weren't going to do this anymore. Let's cut all that out. So at the very least, let's try and reduce and eliminate, if possible, this particular consequence for our target behavior. But more importantly, we need to identify what we want this student to do instead. We want to teach a replacement behavior, right? Instead of our target physical aggression or self-injury or running away or spitting or whatever it might be, what do we want the student to do instead of that behavior? We have a tendency to just think about inappropriate behavior in terms of no, stop doing that, don't, whatever. But clearly in all these cases, what we really want is for him or her to do something else. We want them to engage in an appropriate alternative. So we need to teach that, and more importantly, we need to reinforce that. Right? They're not just going to do something else instead. These target behaviors, these inappropriate behaviors have been learned and shaped and maintained over time. They won't just go away. You can't just say, here's what I want you to do instead. Why won't you just do this instead? We need to teach that behavior, and more importantly, we need to reinforce it. And if you remember from part 1, reinforcing it should best be accomplished when we reinforce it with the same consequences that are already maintaining inappropriate behavior. That's the point with doing the functional assessment. So let me just mention that first piece in more detail. As I mentioned, extinction is the technical term for removing that consequence that has previously been maintaining inappropriate behavior. To stick with the attention example, if I stop attending to this behavior, technically what I'm trying to do is put that behavior on extinction, thereby decreasing the probability of that behavior because I've removed the reinforcement for it. And if I can do so consistently and accurately, that behavior should go down. If that consequence is really maintaining the behavior, if I get rid of it, I can decrease it. I can eliminate it. But as I mentioned, in most cases, the first thing that happens is what's referred to as an extinction burst. So as a part of extinction, one of the things that you need to do is prepare for that. Expect it. Now, don't expect this to go on and on for weeks. It should be fairly short in nature. You're talking about just a few data points in nature. This isn't something that should go on for weeks or months, and if somebody tells you, oh, it's an extinction burst, but it's 6 months later, it's not still. So it should be relatively short, but you should expect one and prepare for it, and prepare not to deliver that same consequence if the behavior escalates. So the most common example that you hear with regard to extinction burst probably relates to vending machines. And many of you have probably heard this example before. I think largely because most adult Americans have plenty of experience with vending machines. But the example is very stark, and we've all been through it. So you have a history of engaging in specific behavior related to a vending machine, a specific stimulus. It's snacks or sodas, and you engage in behavior of putting money in and making a selection and then being reinforced for that series of behaviors. When you have used a vending machine and nothing's come out, in essence, that's one instance of your behavior being put on extinction. And I promise you, nobody has just put in their money, made a selection, nothing happened, and gone, and walked away. Right? I know you didn't do that. What you did was made a different selection or pushed it several times. Oh, I really wanted the Diet Coke. It doesn't even say sold out. Now I'm going to have to get orange soda. I mean, who really drinks orange soda? So you engage in what's referred to as an extinction burst. You engage in more of that same behavior. You didn't get reinforced, so you escalate. And in fact, you may escalate further, jiggle the thing and stick your hand in, and oh, come on, I'm really thirsty. I really wanted the Snickers bar. And you engage in this extinction burst. And you might even do that twice with the same vending machine. But you know over time, You're not going to do that 10 times or 20 times or 30 times. If you do it more than 3 or 4 times, you're a fool. Just give me your money. Stop putting it in that machine. And then also it's important that extinction always be paired with some reinforcement procedure. So don't just do extinction. It's very difficult, right? It's very difficult not to fail if that's your plan. Well, we're going to ignore this inappropriate behavior. You also need some reinforcement procedures, because generally, if all you're doing in practical applied settings is extinction, you'll probably fail. So we'll talk about some reinforcement procedures. As I mentioned before, we want to identify alternative behavior. What do we want the student to do instead? And let's apply those same consequences that we think are maintaining inappropriate behavior to these replacements. Let's make these replacement behaviors functionally equivalent. Let's reinforce what we want the student to do instead more often, more consistently, more predictably, and do it with the same things, attention or escape avoidance, right? How often do you use escape avoidance as a reinforcer? This student's doing great, he's finally doing his math. Great, stop there, you're not done yet, but you can quit. How often do you do that? What a powerful reinforcer that is. You know, if your boss walked into your office and said, you know what, you're working hard today, get out of here, how awesome would that be? But it's hardly ever used as a reinforcer. You know what, usually when a kid who's struggling with a lot of behavioral issues has a good day and works hard, nobody wants to poke the bear. Everybody's like, oh, we're getting some work out of him, let's do more, right? That's very punishing for steps in the right direction. So we want to use reinforcers associated with the functions of inappropriate behavior. And we want to do them contingently. If you look under the optimum conditions, we want to do them contingently, right? So these consequences are contingent on positive behavior. You get them when you engage in positive behavior, and you don't get them when you don't. Immediate, right? Fun Friday, forget it. It doesn't work. Fun Friday is great for the kid who doesn't have any issues. Fun Friday reinforces a lot of Friday afternoon behavior and no Monday morning behavior. Consequences that occur immediately after behaviors are the ones that tend to be most effective. And lastly, an issue that's particularly relevant for people with autism is those reinforcers need to be appropriate to the person. Now, certainly this speaks to the functions, as I've been mentioning throughout, but you also know, say, for example, if you think the function of a particular behavior is access to tangible reinforcement. For a person with autism, that tangible reinforcement might be access to this old plastic fishing rod because he wants to do that and watch the line go back and forth. That's not a reinforcer for me, but it might be for one of your students. So it would be appropriate for him and not for me. Now let me just give you one other example about the nature of these conditions for reinforcement. And this will invariably make someone uncomfortable. But I love to use it because it's such a perfect example. So let's talk about smoking behavior, because millions of people on this planet smoke tobacco. Let's talk about smoke and tobacco. Well, it has a number of consequences. Some are positive, some are negative, right? So let's talk about the positive ones. Tobacco has some physical reinforcers. Nicotine has some very small physical reinforcers. Has some social reinforcers. Smokers all get together and, get cancer together. If you've ever been past the smoking, whatever it's called, I'm sure it's called a lounge. The smoking lounge at Hartsfield International, I want to pull the fire alarm when I walk by that place. I feel like I get cancer just walking by it. But there's certainly a social aspect to it. There's some escape avoidance, right? So in our building, there's an exit, and all the smokers hang out there and, smoke. While they escape or avoid work. So there's some escape avoidance associated with it. All these things are positive. And then, of course, there are some negative consequences for smoking. And if you don't know this already, then, hopefully I'm doing you a public service. Those include heart disease, lung cancer, throat cancer, emphysema, you name the bad thing that happens to a body, it's somehow associated with smoking. Baldness, and if you're a smoker, hopefully you hear this and go, oh boy, I gotta quit. But you're gonna die, okay? Smoking causes cancer and death. That's certainly a negative consequence. That's an aversive outcome of particular behavior. The problem is it's not contingent. If I have a cigarette right now, I'm not gonna drop dead. So you don't die from every cigarette. You die from having 20,000 cigarettes or whatever it is. It's certainly not immediate, right? My grandfather smoked Luckies and drank Wild Turkey every day until, he fell on his head. But those punishers, those aversive consequences, they're not immediate, they're not contingent, and therefore they don't compete, even though they're huge. They don't compete with the reinforcers, the piddly little reinforcers. The nicotine, if you ask a smoker, they wouldn't tell you that, oh wow, yeah, it makes me feel great. They get a little escape avoidance, they get some social, it's part of their routine. There's this sort of conditioned reinforcement, like, oh, I had a bad day, I have to have a cigarette. They're all contingent and they're all immediate, and therefore those consequences maintain this awful behavior that kills people. Because those are the consequences that most impact behavior. And I think that's important to consider as we deliver consequences both purposefully and inadvertently to the people that we work with and the people that we live with, frankly. It's the consequences that are contingent and immediate and predictable and consistent that maintain behavior. And frankly, the way I respond to severe behavior tends to be more immediate, more predictable, and more consistent. And hopefully the way I respond to it isn't reinforcing that, because it's going to happen every time. I'm going to do that more consistently than the way I respond to the kid who sits quietly and works hard and does what he or she is supposed to. If I'm in a classroom and I want to predict the way that people are going to respond to me, am I going to have a better chance at predicting a response if I stand up and start throwing my clothes off, or if I just sit quietly and work on what I'm supposed to work on? I guarantee you it's the former, if it's just about knowing exactly what's going to happen every time. So remember that when you think about reinforcement. We want our reinforcers to meet these conditions, to be contingent, immediate, and appropriate to the person. Okay, so I want to end with one particular example that sort of ties many of these pieces together. I'm going to talk about a student named Kevin, not his real name, of course, but I want to describe one of his behaviors and the intervention that we applied and the outcome for it. So Kevin had a history of engaging in spitting behavior, and as you can see in this baseline section, he was doing it pretty frequently. So in fact, sometimes as many as 80 to 100 or more times per day, but on average somewhere in the range of sort of the high 30s, maybe low 40s. And this was happening every day. So some of them were, he would kind of spit into his finger and play with his saliva, and some of them were on people who were trying to teach him. So you might sit at a table with Kevin and ask him to do work, and he would spit on you. That, of course, was pretty aversive for his instructors. And as we analyzed all of his ABC data, we found that there were a few different patterns. So related to the antecedents, these events of spitting almost always occurred in work situations. In other words, demand situations, when people were placing demands on Kevin. That's when his spitting was most likely to occur. He had some that sort of looked more self-stimulatory in nature, and those could occur anywhere. But the majority of these were in work situations. So related to the antecedents, those were the most common. Related to the consequences, there were a few that were relatively consistent. And I want you to think about what those might be. So if you're watching this online, just take a second and think about the ways in which you think that people, or how you would respond to spitting behavior. And as you might imagine, it often resulted in lots of attention. It wasn't, oh, Kevin, I love the way you're spitting on me. It was often, no, we do not spit. People always use the plural, we do not spit, even though clearly that's not true. It should have been, I don't spit, you're spitting on me. But we do not spit, no. And then in some cases when he continued to do it, in fact, in many cases, Kevin would go to timeout. So it just got to be too much. We do not, that is enough. You do not spit on me. You need to go to timeout. And I can tell you from direct observations that was not aversive. Kevin certainly didn't mind timeout. In fact, he would often sit there and engage in self-stimulatory behavior, which looked pretty reinforcing. So it appeared as though, based on these data, particularly that common antecedents were demand, and that common consequences were attention and timeout, that it was related to one or both of the following. Escape or avoidance, right? So the fact that he engaged in it often in response to demands suggests escape avoidance. The timeout is certainly a possibility that was reinforcing a lot of his behavior. And then we also had to consider the possibility that all of this, sort of, for lack of a better term, chewing him out was reinforcing this spitting behavior. So it's possible that one or both of those consequences was maintaining that spitting behavior. So based on that information, if that's our descriptive assessment, that data and those direct observations and feedback from staff, based on that information and that hypothesis, what sort of treatment would you design? What should our strategies be to reduce that behavior? So think about that for a minute. Remember, what we want to do is identify alternatives. What do we want them to do instead? And we want to provide those same consequences for that behavior, right? We want to make that behavior functionally equivalent. We also want to try and reduce those consequences for his target behavior. So we want to try and put spitting on extinction. So what would we do? Well, let's assume that Kevin didn't like to work. I think that's probably fair. And not uncommon. A lot of kids who participate in school, a lot of adults who participate in work, don't like it. And they are motivated to avoid it. So let's assume that he doesn't like to work. Well, what do we want him to do? Well, what we wanted him to do was ask to stop, ask for a break, to tell us. We wanted him to use language. And by the way, if you're not sure about a replacement behavior, go with language. When you think about what I want this individual to do instead, particularly if you're talking about a special needs individual, and you're not sure what you want them to do instead, go with language. You want them to use words or signs or exchange, picture exchange or some sort of device to communicate what they want, to communicate what they need. So in our case, what we wanted him to do was to tell us, I don't want to work. And Kevin at this time was a kid who was almost totally non-vocal, but we'd been working on quite a bit of sign language, so he had a relatively moderate repertoire. At the time, he probably had about 50 signs that he could use. And so we decided to teach him to sign stop, right? He's working, he doesn't want to work, he can sign stop, and we can say, stop, I hear you, we'll stop. Obviously, we can't always stop, but that's how we want him to communicate instead of spitting. So his plan became, when we sat down to work, if Kevin spit, we wanted spitting to be on extinction, so you didn't talk about it, you didn't chew him out. That went over really well, by the way, with everybody. Don't say anything about it. Keep working. He's got to keep working. It doesn't get attention, it doesn't get escape avoidance. Don't ever take him to timeout for spitting. Let's put that on extinction. And that alone, if we could stick to it, my guess would have reduced spitting. But as you might imagine, it would probably be hard to get everybody to really get on board with don't ever attend to or provide a consequence in any way for spitting behavior. So certainly one piece of it was if he spits, you got to make him keep working. And don't chew him out. Don't, draw so much attention or provide all this attention for spitting. But alternately, and more importantly, we got to teach him to use stop. And it's got to work better. Right now, spitting works fantastic. And I know you can imagine a situation where you're trying to teach this kid to sign that he or she wants out of work, and you have a bunch of work to do. So you'd say, I hear you, I know you want to stop, but we have to finish this first. Don't start that way. That doesn't work as well, because spitting's been getting him out of it hundreds of times. So when we introduce this, it's got to work better. So for 2 days with Kevin, let's go to work. So on the very first time, let's work, sit him down. Do you want to stop? And the very first time we had to model it, take his hand, stop, say, oh, you want to stop? Okay, you can have a break. And he'd get 2 minutes, time to work. Oh, you want to stop? Prompt him through it, stop, okay, got a break. Well, it didn't take very long before you walk to Kevin, and he's immediately doing that. So the speech teacher said he was stuttering. But he'd do it immediately. The adults approach me when they want me to work, and so he'd start sign and stop right away. So at first we'd say, that's spontaneous. Now we're not prompting him. Oh, you want to stop? Okay, great. You can have 2 more minutes. He was just sign and stop all the time, constantly. At the same time, by the way, if he resorted to spitting, okay, we're going to work. And he was prompted to sit down and do 2 minutes of non-spitting work. So you just had to sit there and take it as a result of spitting. Spitting did not get him out of work. This did. Consistently, every time, right away. So he started to rely on this. But clearly we can't stop there. He's going to need to do something else. So what we started to do on the 3rd day was, I hear you, you want to stop, we got to do one thing first. So he'd sit down and you'd do something simple. Do this and he'd do that. And you'd say, great, you want to stop? If he signed stop, okay, take a break. If he spit, then we'd get out cards and, make him actually, do more work. So gradually, over many trials, we started to do 2 things and then 3 things and require him to do more and more work. All of the time, if he spit, he had to have 2 minutes of non-spitting work. And we just slowly started to increase the amount that he had to do. So throughout this time and continuing indefinitely, this was the best and only way to get out of work. Spitting was not. Now, if you look at, and if you look at after baseline, the title is Ignoring and Man Training. Man refers to a requesting function. We were teaching him to ask to stop or ask for a break. So we were ignoring the spitting and teaching him to man for it. If you look at that treatment condition, you can see over time there are a few spikes. There are a few times where this goes back up. And in fact, over that same time, the behavior never really goes away. There are a few data points where it's at or close to 0, but you can see that it's sort of maintained. So I want to talk about each of those separately and see what everybody thinks about that. So let's start with the first one, because I think this is really interesting. It's not so interesting when the spitting's going on, but it's interesting now. Some of these data points, if you look on, say, May 11th, or right after the data point at 5:10, you see that they're probably at about 10 per day. And they were sort of maintaining at that level fairly consistently after a pretty dramatic drop after the implementation of intervention. Almost all of this spitting behavior was the spitting into his hand and playing with it. That wasn't necessarily associated with work. Why might that be? Why did that behavior not go away? That behavior didn't go away because we didn't address a self-stimulatory function. So if this behavior was self-stimulatory, he was sort of playing with his saliva, it wasn't related to escape avoidance. It wasn't related to attention. It's not related to consequences that we're delivering. And therefore, our intervention didn't impact that behavior at all. The form of that behavior is roughly equivalent. It's still spitting behavior. But the function is different, and therefore that behavior didn't change at all because our intervention didn't address self-stimulatory behavior. What about these other data points that spiked? Does anybody have an idea what those might be? So you should sort of write this down and email it to me and see how many people are correct. These were substitute staff, either new staff or substitute staff. So imagine you're the new person and you come in and you're working with Kevin, and someone like me says, okay, if he spits on you, just ignore it. And he might spit on you several times. Just ignore it. Nobody liked that. People were like, what? This boy's not spitting on me. And in fact, he did. So our response generally became, well, he probably is going to. You can decide whether you want him to spit on you once or 100 times. And I can tell you that the way you respond to it will probably dictate that. So generally, we could convince people after that first day, okay, how do I get this kid to stop spitting on me? But it would hop right back up very quickly if people responded to it. So that behavior would come back pretty quickly if we couldn't maintain that alternative as a functionally equivalent and sort of more efficient behavior for Kevin. So this is a pretty good example of all the things that I just talked about. It's a good example of doing an assessment on his diagnostics, antecedents, and consequences, and using those to derive or arrive at some hypotheses for function, and then using those functions to develop an intervention that taught him replacement behavior and that reinforced his replacement behavior with those same consequences. It made his replacement behavior functionally equivalent. And I would suggest that with most of your students, if you start with some of those indirect and descriptive tools, you collect some data and get some observations and derive some hypothesis, design a plan based on those, and again, you can get some help if you need it. Implement that plan, make sure it's being implemented correctly, and measure whether or not these behaviors are changing from baseline. You'll find that in many cases you can reduce those behaviors. And in situations where you can't, or they're escalating, or they're particularly severe, those may be students who need extra resources or extra support, or maybe a sort of an escalating assessment even to functional analysis, like I mentioned, with sort of an extra level of expertise. I would suggest that if you do those things, you can be pretty successful in a lot of cases. So we're going to wrap up with that. Again, as I mentioned, there are a variety of resources that are supplemental to this presentation in the folder, to which there's a link in the description, including these slides, a couple of articles, and some sample worksheets, one of which is a behavior checklist, and one of which is just sort of a simple functional assessment and behavior plan design worksheet. So you're welcome to use any of those. I think that while this particular training relates to those first two levels and is somewhat general, these details can help you do these types of strategies in many cases. And this is information that is pretty widely available. This is something that most people should be able to access and use on their own. So please feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions or concerns or comments. I'd certainly appreciate them. And if you're actually still with me, then I also appreciate your time and attention. Thanks.